My name is Stephanie Grader, and I'm one of the core faculty in the Center for Latin American Studies. And I'm very happy to be introducing our speakers for today. But before I do that, I just wanted to let everyone know that we have another exciting event next week, discussing, it's a forum that's going to be discussing transformations in Chile's constitution and environmental protections. And the forum will include UA faculty member, Professor Carl Bauer, as well as two of his colleagues, legal scholars from Chile, Matthias Gulof and Dominique Hervé. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. But today we're really excited to have a book forum. First I'll introduce you to the author, Dr. Maurice Raphael Magaña, who is a sociocultural anthropologist and assistant professor of Mexican American Studies and social cultural and critical theory here at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on the cultural politics of youth organizing, transnational migration, urban space and social movements in Mexico and the United States, offering a transnational perspective on historic marginalization, racialization, youth political culture, and the role of art in activism. Today, we'll be discussing his first book, Cartographies of Youth Resistance, Hip Hop, Punk, and Urban Autonomy in Mexico, which was published just last year through University of California Press. And to help us with to discuss the book, we are very pleased to have as our discussant Professor Michelle Téllez, who is also faculty in the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona, and is an interdisciplinary scholar trained in community studies, sociology, Chicano studies, and education. Raised along the US-Mexico border herself, both her scholarly and community engaged work is deeply shaped by this experience, including work on transnational community formations and disruptions, Chicano mothering, and gender migration. Now, before we get started, I just want to let you know a little bit about the format for today. We're going to begin with a quick introduction to the book itself from Professor Magaña, and that will be followed by about 10 to 15 minutes of commentary, questions, and reflections by Professor Téllez. That will sort of jumpstart our conversation. We'll give Professor Magaña a little bit of time to respond to those reflections before turning it over to the audience for further questions and discussion. However, throughout the talk, if you're inspired to ask something or want to leave a comment in the chat, please go ahead and do that, and we'll address it when we get to the Q&A. But you can also wait and raise your hand, and I'll call on everyone in the audience when it's their turn. I could ask that if everyone during the actual presentations of our two speakers, if you would turn off your video to sort of save on bandwidth, but then we'd also, once we get to the discussion, love to invite all of you to turn on your video again, so that we're speaking to faces, not to us. Anyway, I will turn the voice over to Professor Magaña to get us going. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here.
Great, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that introduction, and to Andrea as well for at the Center for Latin American Studies for helping with the logistics of getting this organized, as well as my colleagues in Mexican American Studies for co-sponsoring today's talk, and of course for agreeing to be the discussant for today. I apologize ahead of time if my internet is a little bit, if it cuts in and out, maybe somebody can just tell me in the chat box, and I'll switch to my personal hotspot. So, since we do have such a short amount of time, and we're really hoping for this to be more of a conversation, to start off, I'm just going to give a very brief sort of empirical and theoretical grounding of what the book's about, and what the sort of main interventions it's trying to make are, and then we'll hear from Dr. Téllez, which I think we'll get a little bit more into the nuance of the book. So the book itself empirically is really about the life of social movements, right? And it is grounded in a specific social movement that emerges in the Mexican state of Oaxaca in 2006. It begins as a pretty clear sort of labor union struggle with the teachers union going on strike to sort of pressure the government into negotiating new contracts and more resources for public schools, public education, scholarships, things like that. But that year, the governor, instead of negotiating with the teachers, decided to send the police into families and their supporters who were it seems like I was muted for a moment there. So that year, the governor sent in the teachers to violently evict sent in the police to violently evict the teachers. And then this sort of sparks this massive social movement. People flood to the streets in support of the teachers and in opposition to the authoritarianism of the state government. The police returned to their barracks, and the governor and much of his cabinet flee the state, and in that vacuum emerges this massive social movement of Oaxacan society, who for 6 months had grassroots control of the city. And so the book really looks at how youth participated in that 6 months of direct democracy in Oaxaca. And then what happens really in the 10 years that follow after the movement loses physical control of the city, right? There was a massive campaign of repression from the federal government, who sent military trained police in to retake the city at the end of 2006. And so that's how the movement loses physical control of the city. But then the book really is trying to make an intervention in how we understand both the temporality and the spatiality of social movements, right? So the sort of dominant narrative was that the movement was over once they lost physical control of the city, that the movement had failed because its main goals were not achieved, which were having the governor removed from office, having a new, more inclusive state constitution, and demanding an end of the repression of political dissent. So the book really tries to get us to think more deeply about how and why social movements matter. What does social movement activism look like, specifically trying to connect the more spectacular moments of mobilization that are more easily recognizable as social movement activity with the more mundane everyday forms of organizing. And so that's really where the ethnography comes in. And I, over a period of a little bit over 10 years, I look at the spaces and the political projects that young people who sort of came of political age in the context of that 6 months of grassroots control, what happened to them politically and socially after the movement lost physical control of the city. And so 2006 is a really important year in the story of the book, both because of the movement, but also because 2006 marks really the escalation of the militarization of Mexican society under the drug war. And so the protagonists in the book, I call the 2006 generation, to sort of signal how formative both the social movement, the grassroots control of the city for them and their politics was, but also the brutal repression that was unleashed on the movement and that continues to this day under the guise of the drug war. And so the protagonists of the book are a collective, a network of collectives of young people in the city. Many of them are migrants from indigenous communities throughout the state, or the children of migrants. And so the book really, looks at what are the ways that they create meaningful avenues for social and political participation in the years that followed losing the physical control of the city. So I'll leave my sort of brief introduction there, so we have time for more conversation, but I just wanted to quickly ground the book there. And I'll say one more thing in terms of the theoretical intervention. Really what I argue in the book is that we can get a better sense of other ways of doing politics if we focus on the intersection of how space is produced and how youth culture sort of is part of that process of producing, contesting, and transforming space. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Téllez.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and for those visuals that really bring us there. So good afternoon, everyone who has joined us. Thank you to LAS, MAS, and all those folks who made this possible. And for those of us who are not here in Tucson, I want to say greetings from Oaxaca territory. And, as a colleague and friend who witnessed at least part of the journey of creating and writing this incredible book, it is truly an honor to share this screen with mi gran colega Maurice Magaña. The thought and care with which this book was written and the commitment to the radical imagination we find in the story that is told can be seen cover to cover. From the heartfelt dedication to the commitment of placing young people at the center of a social movement that has been named for the first insurrection of the 21st century. So what I'd like to do is first just address Mauricio directly with a few of my comments, of course, you all too, that I have about the book. And then I'm going to introduce a set of 3 questions, or sets of questions really, that I'm hoping he and I can be in dialogue about before then we turn it to the audience. So Mau, your storytelling expresses great emotion, clarity, a deep analysis, and presence. One of the intellectual interventions that you make invites us to disrupt an understanding of social movements as linear, as having a clear beginning and ending, but also it pushes us against measurements of success defined by outsiders. Here you demonstrate that our imaginations have to be bigger. What does it mean for grassroots bodies to take control over space by which these movements come to shape ideologies, experiences, futures, even if the state reasserts its control through physicality, violence, and threats? You give us theoretical tools to help us understand how counter spaces are created in response to neoliberal militarization through autonomy, comunalidad, and rebel aesthetics. Through this lens, you give us the capacity to see how power is never all-encompassing, but is constantly contested through what I and our colleagues Patricia Gonzalez and Roberto Rodriguez have called creation resistance. When young people organize, they are drawing upon long histories of struggles to imagine what is possible as they build towards this notion of decolonial anarchism and urban autonomy that you highlight in your book. By also noting the intergenerational activism and the multi-directionality of social movements, we are able to grasp the tensions and the opportunities for growth that come when one has a commitment to radical change. Theoretically, you also build on Robin D.G. Kelley to discuss the value of having a physical space for engagement, to create ideas, to build communities, even if the encroachment of capital in our everyday lives make it highly impossible to have these public spaces. And perhaps this is something we can talk about in relation to Tucson later. Your book and the youth you write about show us how new forms of sociality, political and social imagining, and horizontal political cultures are built despite state dispossession and erasure. I found the conversation of those older activists who describe these spaces of urban autonomy as utopian islands really interesting. Really, it was a way of dismissing the work of the youth, right? But what they're also dismissing is the potential and the impact in what you are outlining as a model of politics otherwise, right? So indeed, there's no single way to challenge the system that we are living in, but connecting these struggles or these autonomous struggles is a way to create and expand the alternatives in the present. And it reminds me of the work of, you know, how John Holloway talks about the fissures, connecting the fissures, or Rebecca Citrin, who you cite in your book, talks about connecting the ruptures, and Los Zapatistas, right, who are also highly embedded throughout your text when they say we have to deepen the cracks or the grietas, right, between communities. And in this way, we can create the world we want now through these connections. I think your book is visually dynamic, as folks were able to see in this introduction that you gave us. It's visually dynamic, engaging. The photos included helps to map the overall story of the 2006 generation. And of course, I want to give my amiga and artist, Susi Chavez Herrera, a shout out for her incredible contribution there, among other photographers, of course. But these visuals gives us a lens of how these artists and activists are changing the urban landscape of heritage Oaxaca through the proliferation of art spaces, murals, music, and public art. So in closing to these initial comments, one of your interlocutors, Daniel, notes when he's discussing the transnational mega projects that are encroaching, he writes, or he says, and you write, those projects don't come to negotiate. They come to disappear entire communities. They come to exterminate language, traditions, and ways of life. I think it is very important to shine light on what is happening right now in Oaxaca. And to me, this book is exactly that, is what you're doing. So thank you for this incredible contribution, Mauricio. So the questions. So the first set of questions, one of the things that I found in the book is that overall, it's a deeply relational book. And like both in how you write and then how you talk about the communities and the activists that you're writing about. And so my first set of questions, or my first question would be, you know, you start the book with when I arrived to Oaxaca, right? And then I want to know, well, how did you arrive? You know, what brought you to this? So it's something about your personal journey towards this work, who you are and what your involvement represents to you in terms of this written text. And in relationship to this, the second question, as I was reading your book, I was thinking about Lacey Abrego when she writes about research as accompaniment. And she writes, my practices of accompaniment stand in opposition to settler colonial standards of objectivity, but my work is rigorous in ways that matter beyond academic norms. This becomes evident to others through the emotional nature of the work. My practices of accompaniment give me access to people's lives in ways that can evoke deep emotions from study participants, readers, and audience members. And this is something that I really read as I was going through your book. And you also include these sort of like subtle insertions of how you yourself move between spaces and how you participate. Like you get a text from Arte Jaguar in one moment, right? And you mention that. And then another time you say, you know, we were at the Cinco Señores intersection and we started marching back to the Zócalo and 5 contingents. So you're ever present, but never truly insert yourself. And so I want to hear about, as a writer, how you made those choices and as a researcher, right? Those are the first sets of questions. And then the second set of questions are around the transnational scope of your scholarly engagement. So your book really shows us how ideas, people, strategies, tactics, and histories cross-border. And while we understand that people do and are contained, our imaginations cannot be. So I don't think, though, however, that this is an easy task as a scholar activist, perhaps if that's how you define yourself, to engage with this scholarship across borders. So I'm interested in thinking that through with you. What does it mean for you as a Chicano Latino scholar? What does it mean for our field of Chicanic studies, Mexican American studies, and how might this expand, this body of work? And then I guess the final, do you want me to stop there and then we start talking, and then we move into some sort of the tactics of the movement, or should I just keep going?
We have time for you to finish up if you want.
Okay.
Maybe for the flow, maybe I'll respond a little bit to those and then throw it back to you so that it's a little bit more of a conversation. So thank you so much for your really beautiful reflections on the book and the work, and for these questions. So I will, I'll try to keep it short, but I will also say for folks who are interested in hearing a little bit more about the the way that I came to the research and how the book really sort of took shape. I recently did a really wonderful interview with the folks at New Books Network. And so from their New Books in Anthropology series, the podcast was just published a couple of days ago. And we really kind of go into that in a lot more detail. So I'll give, a brief bit of that now, but for folks who want to know more, I encourage you to check out that New Books in Anthropology podcast that was recently published. And so I think talking a little bit about that kind of gets at your other two sorts of questions. So I'll try to maybe get at all of them together. And so you're absolutely right. The book really starts off with me already there and already sort of trying to make sense of what I'm seeing versus what I expected to see and all of this. But I think like many of us, all of us really, I think our research really is really shaped by our biographies and by our own experiences, right? And my interest in Mexican social movements, youth activism, and transnational work comes from my experience, growing up both in Mexico and in the United States, to a father who was part of the 1968 student movement at the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, in 1968, which is a really important historical sort of reference point for youth activism in Mexico, as it is globally, but especially in Mexico, the 1968 is really significant. And so my father was a student at the UNAM when this, when they do their first strike, and the movement was really protesting that Mexico was going to host the Olympics in 1968, given the dire needs of Mexican people that were not being met by the government. So how could the government be spending all this money to host the Olympics and put on a show for a global audience when its own people were starving, right? And so that's what they're protesting. And, they were met with, horrific brutality by the Mexican government. The military opened fire on protesting students. Unknown numbers of people were killed. And that moment really marked my father, and it really marked his generation, right? Sort of having this huge sort of, youth-led movement where the imagination was, the sky was the limit. And then to have it so brutally snatched away and squashed, right? And so I grew up having very fragmented conversations with my father, sort of about his reflections on politics in the US, politics in Mexico. What did resistance look like? Why weren't there more massive mobilizations, for example, in the United States against the Iraq War? And things like that really didn't, generationally and with the national political culture, really there was a disconnect. And so my father oftentimes would ask me, why isn't your generation doing anything? Like, this is what my generation did. But then at the same time, when he would see me getting more involved, he'd be like, hey, you need to be real careful because the government will kill you. Like, they won't think twice about it. And so it was this sort of, juxtaposition about what does youth-led social change look like, but then also recognizing, the very limits to that. And so, so that very much shaped my interest in understanding social movements and coming up with a different language and a different lens through which to understand what activism looks like. And then, the book itself is a combination of those interests that I had when I started graduate school in fall of 2006. And, just the serendipity of the fact that the summer before I started graduate school, this massive movement emerges in Oaxaca. And also the serendipity of the fact that my soon-to-be PhD advisor, Lynn Stephen, had been working in Oaxaca for decades. And I didn't go study with her because she worked in Oaxaca. I actually went to study with her because she worked in Chiapas. She has a book, Zapata Lives, where she talks about both the Zapatista movement and the indigenous autonomy struggles in Oaxaca. And before grad school, I had done human rights work in Chiapas in Zapatista-based communities. And so I thought that's what I was going to end up pursuing in graduate school. So I went to study with her because of her knowledge of that history. But then lo and behold, this movement emerges. And it became very clear that this was a very important movement, and that it would, make a lot of sense for me to shift my focus there. And so that's how I ended up working in Oaxaca. Oaxaca is actually one of the few states in Mexico that I do not have a blood family. I do have family in Chiapas, and so I was able to kind of get settled in there that way. But in Oaxaca, it was circumstance, and then the book itself, it emerges from, it builds on the work I did for my master's thesis, which was really highlighting the role of the teachers, which again were the more visible sort of part of the movement and the more well-known sort of opposition political force in Oaxacan politics. So I think my connection might be a little bit bad here, so I'm gonna turn off my.
I can hear you.
It's okay. I'm not chopping. Yeah. Okay, great. And so the master's paper really focused on the teachers and looking at the alliances that they made in order for this movement to become such a broad-based movement. And in the process of working with teachers and with doing that research, the sort of invisibility of youth in the emerging narratives of the movement became very clear. I actually had a teacher tell me at one point, she compared what it was like sort of being in the streets with the youth versus being in the streets with her fellow teachers union members. And she was like, the teachers, sort of deride the youth for being, too radical or for being provocateurs, for wearing, covering their faces with bandanas or ski masks. She's like, but I'd much rather be like shoulder to shoulder with these youth who get their heads cracked open by the police to protect us because of their political commitment, not because of their duty to the teachers union. And so she was insinuating that many of the teachers were basically, felt pressured to be in these mobilizations because the teachers union was sort of taking count, who's here, who's not here. And the youth didn't have anybody checking on them like that. They were there because they really wanted to be there. And so that really planted the seed to find out what is going on here. How can the youth be such at one point such an important part of the movement, but also so invisible when it comes to who gets to talk about the movement, who, when journalists show up, who gets interviewed, when academics show up, who do they write about? And so that sort of set me on that path. And then if it comes up later in the conversation, I can talk a little bit more about how I actually, arrived to those spaces. But that sort of was the shift to focus on youth. And research as accompaniment, I think, is a really, is a really beautiful way to describe, I think, the kind of research, that we both do. There's a lot of different sorts of frameworks that people offer. There's activist, activist research, militant ethnography that our dear late friend Jeff Juris really coined and practiced, I think, in a really beautiful way as well. But I think accompaniment really signals both the political commitment to the communities that we're working with, and also the fact that there is a power relation there, right? We're not the same. We might belong to overlapping communities, but we're there as researchers, and there's a certain amount of protection that affords us, especially as researchers with US passports working in Mexico. And so I think it's important to acknowledge both the subjective commitment to those communities and a rejection of the sort of claims to objectivity, but also positioning ourselves, in relationship to various power fields of power, right? So I think, research as accompaniment absolutely is a great way to capture that. And then the transnational nature of the conversations, that the book tries to intervene in, and the transnational circuits of migration and culture and politics that I try and trace through the book, I think also is just a result of that growing up back and forth and feeling that really we owe it to our counterparts on the other side of the border to acknowledge, the knowledge that they produce and have been producing about these movements and being in conversation with them. And so, I think it's really important, our sort of citational politics, that we don't only cite scholars based in the global north and scholars that don't only publish in English. And so for me, that's a political decision, but it's also a decision that I think yields a much fuller picture of these conversations that we're trying to have. So I'll leave it there and throw it back to you.
Thank you, Mal. That was tremendous, really great. So many places that we can pick up from, but I'm going to move us a bit. I want to share another quote. So your book focuses on two movements, two organizing spaces, Casota and Vocal, right? And so one of the folks that you introduce us to is an organizer from Vocal who says, "We need to find strategies of protest that reach those in power, those that abuse, without harming or upsetting people who are just trying to work, humble people like us struggling to make a living." Now, I think that it's a very powerful quote for so many reasons, because it's talking about the organizing logics. I mean, I think you do an incredible job about talking about urban autonomy, urban indigeneity. And I really do appreciate this sort of detailed attention that you give to both horizontal and vertical political cultures and structures and ways of organizing. And as they respond to what you note are highly hierarchical, violent times that we're living, right? And so really beautifully done. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you also bring in this notion of intergenerational activism, and where like the flows of knowledge go between spaces, right? And there's like you use multi-directionality, again, really important. So there's a lot to be said about all of this, but I'm going to just ask one question and then we'll see, because it's already 1:35, and then we'll see where the conversation goes, because I can ask more later. But one of the, in talking about comunalidad, you bring in a strategy known as la asamblea, the assembly, right? And I think there's a lot to be said about the power of la asamblea in facilitating all of these organizing logics that you described. So what do you want to share with us a little bit about what that looked like? And then we can open up to the audience. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so the assembly is a really important space and institution and frame of reference for the 2006 generation, right? And so in the context of the 2006 social movement, I spoke about the fact that there was this huge political void, right, in the city after the police, the governor, many of the politicians left the state. The state institutions really ceased to function as such, and so this emerging movement implements a popular assembly as the decision-making structure for the movement, right? And so the assembly has a very rich history in Oaxaca. The teachers union itself has long operated with an assembly component to it, but I think more primarily as it comes to the 2006 generation, a majority of municipalities in Oaxaca are actually governed through indigenous customary law, which has a communal assembly as the main decision-making structure, which means that it is not elected officials who make decisions in a representative political kind of system. It is through consensus that members of the community debate decisions to be made and reach consensus. And so this notion of this more horizontal way of making decisions is really important for the urban autonomy that the youth are experimenting with and are practicing. And so they have this communal assembly as a reference point, but they also understand that even in a communal assembly, there are people who are silenced, and there are certain voices that rise to the top and other voices that are not, right? And in many cases, the youth, because they're not married men, do not have voices even in their pueblos. And so they try to create more inclusive assemblies, right, that are not based on these hierarchies. And then in the context of the social movement, that assembly too, had very egalitarian goals and aspirations, and was certainly much more egalitarian than electoral politics. But still, there is, a certain protagonismo of particularly of men who tend to dominate these spaces. They tend to take up a lot of space and speak over people. And so they're trying to create a sort of parallel kind of politics that takes, the horizontal nature of the assembly, but is more intentional about making it a more inclusive and multi-vocal space. And so that's one component of their urban autonomy politics that they try and implement, right? And so I'll leave it there just again because of time, but I don't know, let me know if there's a follow-up or not to that, because I know this is something, especially with your work and your book that's coming out in the fall, I believe, in the fall through University of Arizona Press. You also are looking at similar issues, right, of urban autonomy in Mexico and what that looks like. And so, we could talk about this for hours, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mal. So yeah, let's open it up, Stephanie, for questions.
Yeah, so feel free to use the raise hand icon if you want to speak your question aloud. It looks like we already have a question from Luis C. in the chat. He writes, one of your interlocutors talks about how the spirit of the movimiento resides within her and is not dependent on space, time, or actual location. Also, you share how your own interest and commitment to engaging with youth resistance and activism is related to your father's influence. Have you noticed the next generations of movements rising from the legacy of Oaxaca 2006 events? Has the next generation started from those seeds?
Thank you, Luis, for that question, and Stephanie for reading it. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's part of the challenge of writing a book is knowing when to end the book or forcing yourself to end the book, right? Exactly because of the question you're asking. The 2006 generation has certainly reached another stage, both in their personal lives, but also in their political projects. And newer generations have followed, right? Generations that participated as children in the 2006 movement, who witnessed what was happening as children, and many of whom were, welcome into the youth spaces that I write about in the book as children, right? And so they have a politics, that very much builds on the 2006 generations, but also has its own, particularities and its own differences. I think one thing that I point to in the book, and that I think is really significant to talk about in terms of newer generations and their radical politics that go beyond the imagination of the state and of electoral politics, is really the ways that sort of anarchist, autonomist, anti-authoritarian movements and the feminist movement are all converging in Mexico right now, as a direct response to the ongoing, feminicides that have been going on in Mexico at this point now for generations, right? But we've reached a point where young women, together with older generations, are just, they've had enough, right? And so they're really forcing Mexican society to stop pretending that this isn't an issue, and really confronting the limits of the electoral politics and the limits of sort of this, neoliberal human rights kind of models where the state and multinational sort of institutions are the people who are supposed to protect human rights, right? Like that system clearly, it's not working, hasn't been working. And so they're putting on the table another kind of politics that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but that's good, right? That's necessary. And so that's where I really look to the way that these different sort of political currents are coming together in the feminist movement in Mexico and in the rest of Latin America as well. So yeah, that's what I would, I think, say about that. And thanks again for the question.
Thank you.
Great, we have another question in the chat from Sarah Dannenbrink. She asks, can you speak to the role of social media platforms and the strategies, methods of political activism in Oaxaca, specifically among youth? Do social media platforms play a noticeable and or important role in youth activism in Oaxaca?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say that for the generation that I focus on in the book, the more, I think the more prevalent sort of technologies that they used and platforms that they used were things like YouTube, in terms of getting video out of what's happening specifically in the context of repression, in real time, to counter the narratives of mainstream media, right? So where mainstream media is saying that nothing's happening, or that, the movements are the violent ones, or, these kinds of familiar narratives. And so being able to just upload raw sort of footage of what is actually happening was really important, continues to be, but especially in the context of the 2006 generation, and other kinds of grassroots sort of alternative media networks were really important. Given the the amount of surveillance that the Mexican state, not unlike the US state and most nation states, the amount of surveillance that the government has over the use of social media, more mainstream platforms, like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, things like that, are not a main tool for this generation. If they use them, which most of them do, it's more for personal, their personal accounts. Sure, they'll have political discussions on them, but they're not putting out, this is what we're doing, these are our actions, this is where I was on this day, like none of that, with good reason, right? And so, yeah, so I'll leave it at that, but that's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So next we have a question from Anna O'Leary, asking, over time, were you able to follow the youth from their coming of age in the movement to adulthood? If so, were you able to talk about their experiences looking back?
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that question. Yeah, that's one of the things that I really, that I think that this book allowed me to do, was trace, a cohort of activists over, a little bit over 10 years, right? And so many of them were teenagers, in 2006, or in their early 20s, and then by the end of the book, right, a lot of them had started families, had, the spaces that I focus on in the book had shut down, the collectives that I write about fractured, transformed, and these kinds of things. And so being able to follow them over that trajectory, I think really is what yields a lot of the sort of theoretical insights of the book, of sort of saying like, okay, how did this movement impact them over time, right? So how do they continue to claim to be the movement? And how do they continue to claim their current projects as the legacy of the movement, right? And so, it absolutely marked them, it shaped them, it informed their politics, but their politics did not stay stuck in time, nor did they. And so being able to follow that evolution over time was really a privilege, and hopefully something that the book is able to convey.
Great. So next we have a question from Kristen Helland, and I'm really glad to see this question because I was actually going to ask you to expand on this dimension of the book as well, since it hasn't come up too much already. She's asking that after having attended a lecture you gave on hip hop of Oaxacan youth in LA, I'm interested in the role that hip hop and punk play in the youth movement in Oaxaca. And she looks forward to reading about this in your book. but it would be great to sort of, I was also curious about, since you foreground that, how you think about that in relation to the other layers of the book that you've been already discussing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's that's part that we hadn't really touched on yet. So what I found was that a lot of the youth who participated as youth in the movement had actually sort of already had a very antagonistic relationship with the state vis-a-vis the police, right? And the reason for this was because of their participation in punk and graffiti and hip hop scenes as youth, right? And so they were already used to being criminalized and being harassed by the police for practicing their, for their cultural practices. And so when that repression against the teachers happens, that sort of ignites this movement, so many of these youth were ready, like they were ready to pounce. Like they time and time again would tell me, like there was a lot of rumors going around at that time that the police were going to come in. And so we were just waiting, like we were on alert. And so the second that, I got that phone call that the police went in, I hopped on my bike and I headed right down there. Or, I was already staying at the encampment because I was waiting for the police and all this. And so they were just that much more willing to really act as, as I sort of talk about in the book. They become, in the context of the movement, sort of this popular security force who is really at the front lines of trying to protect older people and younger people from the police and later from paramilitaries. And so hip hop and punk informs their participation in that way, but then it also informs how they participate after those initial sorts of confrontations with the police in the streets. Again, because a lot of these spaces that were meant to be more horizontal or more inclusive still reproduced a lot of the societal prejudices against working class, migrant, young people, especially punks and graffiti writers and hip hop members of the hip hop community, whether they be themselves artists or just like hip hop heads, but they felt excluded from those spaces, and so they created their own spaces. And some of the ways that they made those spaces open to more youth like themselves was by making hip hop, punk, street art, graffiti, all of these things part of their spaces, in addition to the politics having this cultural component, so that it would be an open space for young people who might not have a particular political ideology or membership, and who might not, political rhetoric might not resonate with them, but whose lived experience resonates, right? And so they were really important also in that way. And then I'll just say, like, at the end of the book, I kind of looking forward of what happened to these folks in these spaces. For some of them, things like street art or hip hop become ways that they're able to become, self-sustained artists who don't have to rely on, on wage labor or things like that. But for others, those avenues are not open because their political cultures, their politics, and their aesthetics are not seen as they can't be incorporated into dominant markets or institutions. And so there's divergent sort of paths depending on the particular scene or culture that they belong to.
Okay, great. Oh, another question in the chat came up. I'm sorry if I say this incorrectly. Abhinav Vatsa is asking, have there been attempts by authorities to prevent this sort of artistic expression in order to cripple the movement?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so again, that's part of where towards the end of the book, I kind of offer these divergent paths that happen. You know, some of the artists are able, you know, to sort of walk this line where they continue to do their political work and their political art while also producing art that's more, shall we say, acceptable to a economy that's heavily reliant on tourism, right? And so, you know, we see in places like Tucson and in so many other places, the way that a certain street art aesthetic is incorporated into these dominant economies and these dominant projects, and others are not, right? And so some artists are able to kind of do both. They do their political community work, but also do their commissions that are seen as acceptable. And then others are not, right? Others are either unwilling to toe that line or unable to because they're just seen as so inherently offensive to those sort of more mainstream sensibilities that they're always already excluded, right? And so there I'm talking about punks and anarchists specifically. And then we see, depending on the government that's in power, we see different strategies, right? Of some trying to co-opt and others repressing. And so it depends also on the particular government in power at the time. So I'll leave it there for time's sake.
We just have a couple of minutes, and I don't know whether Michelle, you wanted to jump in. I have a question that might be a little bit too much to chew on for 2 minutes, but I wanted to see where you felt like going.
No, jump in, go ahead. You haven't asked a question yet, so I would love to.
Well, it's been sort of addressed in a more empirical sense, but I wanted also to give Maurice, if you want to give you a little bit more of an opportunity to draw out the conceptual apparatus that you're using in the book. And I personally was really compelled by the way that you're focusing on the sort of time space of politics, but with a great focus, you know, with the sort of shadow of the big event of the protest, but also the ways in which there's such an ongoingness to politics and these sort of interstices of the between the event with a capital E and yeah, so but you elaborate that both through time and space. So I just wanted to give you a chance to maybe elaborate that a little bit, because I think that's a really, for me, was a really compelling contribution of your work to these broader questions about politics and social movements.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so again, we're in like the minute that we have left. I'll just say real quick, I kind of use two theoretical frameworks to try to get at the ways that politics, time, and space are co-constituted and are non-linear. One is through the idea of counter space that Michelle mentioned earlier. And that's sort of the ways that social movements and artists and activists create sort of spaces that challenge the logics that are operating in dominant space, and sort of give form to a more radical imagining of what space and the social relations that take place in space and that produce space look like. And the other is with sort of the metaphor of the palimpsest. And so kind of to get at the ways that previous iterations of social movements and of politics inform the present and are never fully like they don't disappear, right? They're always kind of present. So I kind of give that metaphor of the palimpsest to give a little bit more of a visual for how that works, but really trying to attend to the ways that these histories and movements are all sort of building on one another and in conversation with one another.
Well, I think that was a perfect teaser to get people excited to see how that gets developed throughout the manuscript. But I wanted to, since we're out of time and this kind of, came together really well. I appreciate all the contributions from the audience, a wonderful discussion from Professor Téllez and of course, Professor Magaña. And thank you all for being here. And we hope to see all of you at our next event on Chile and transformations in the Constitution and protection of the environment. But for now, let's give our speakers our virtual round of applause. And thank you so much for your generosity and time and spirit today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Andrea.